Hello, my friends. Welcome to Let's Be Real. This is episode 5, and this is a very special episode. Our plan was to continue our conversation about unraveling the victim narrative, but due to current events, we wanted to interrupt our plans and invite on a special guest for today. We're going to be talking about race in America and white privilege, and what does it mean to actually engage the conversation and be part of the solution in this really, really difficult area of our country's history and kind of our humanity. So my friend David Bailey is the founder of Arrabon, and it is a racial reconciliation training and developing ministry, and he has joined us for a conversation. We actually had the conversation on Instagram Live. I was able to answer some of your questions, and we are able to now bring that to you in the podcast. Be aware that perhaps the technical difficulties, we had a few of those, and the audio might not be quite perfect, but what David has to say is so rich. He brings a historical perspective, he brings a spiritual perspective, and he actually provides really practical ways forward. So I want to invite you to enjoy this conversation, and you'll find all the resources that David mentions, as well as information about Arrabon in the show notes. All right, here we go.
Welcome to Let's Be Real, a completely honest, entirely practical conversation about how to live our lives with freedom, purpose, and abundance. Popular author and communicator Nicole brings her 20 years of experience as a counselor, pastor, and coach to a real conversation about the tricky questions and tough decisions in life, and how to find clarity in action no matter what obstacle you may face. Have a topic to suggest or a tricky situation you need help with? We'd love to hear from you. Send us an email or voice memo to nicole@nicoleunis.com, where we might feature you on the show. And now here's your host, Nicole Eunice.
Basically, David, if I could recap a little bit of what you just said, what I heard you say was there have been systems in place since the beginning of our country, and we're only 50, 60 years outside of civil rights, and we still have a system that operates exactly as it was built to operate, which has sort of how would you say it, a preference, a power structure that's designed for the European settlers of this country. Is that?
Yeah, totally. And it's like, I love living in America, right? Like when you hear people talk like that, it's just like, I love it. It's just kind of like, it's kind of like with your spouse, right? Like, you know the things that you love the best about them, and then you also know the stuff that's messed up about them.
Yeah.
Right? And the reality of it is, it's like, I think when we can have a sober-minded view of this, then we know how to deal with the situation, right? And I think a big problem is we oftentimes don't have the type of sober-minded view of our country, right? And I choose to live in this country. I could live somewhere else, but it's like I choose to live in this country, and it's really important to understand that this country has done really messed up stuff for such a really long time from a legal standpoint, and that legality created culture and normativity activities and also personal attitudes of individuals. And so then that's why this story with that we're dealing with now is as a result of this really messed up stuff, culture and history that we've had, and it's changing. It's changing quick. It's not changing fast enough. I would say that way.
Yeah. Well, I love what you said, because I think a lot of people kind of throw their hands up and feel this panic and disparage America. And the reality is, you and I have both traveled a lot. We can believe in the greatness of the country that we're in, and also hold out. There's things that we hate about it too. We can have both of those. We don't have to feel like it has to be all one or the other, which I feel like I hear from sort of my white friends, maybe that give this vibe, how dare you disparage our country? I'm like, no, that's not. We don't want to disparage our country, but we need to be sober-minded, like you said, about how this was.
Yeah, totally. Like you and I are both pastors, right? And if you look at the Bible, one of the things that's so true is that God loves us, that we're precious, that we're image bearers. And another thing that's very true is that humans are messed up.
Yeah.
And you see in when God decided to write the scriptures using human beings, God did not put a G rating on that. He didn't do that like Disney filter. It was like Games of Thrones ratchetness going on, right? Like, and so I think in order for you to be able to have a really true view of humanity and a true view of our country, you got to be able to say, like, hey, there's some stuff that's beautiful and some stuff is ratchet, you know?
Yeah. So talk to me about this idea of, I mean, obviously the conversation that ignited here in my little corner was
Uh-huh.
around white privilege
Yeah.
and the reality of white privilege. I've seen people say, well, I'm not privileged. Like, I'm not privileged. So can you define white privilege so that people understand what that means?
Yeah. So it's kind of twofold. So one is just understand, like, where did this come from? Like, where did the notion of whiteness and blackness come from? Prior to prior to the 1700s, people were identified by being a European, by being African, by being not even just European, like an Englishman, a Frenchman, an Irishman. And what happened, there were a lot of European indentured servants that were here, and there were a lot of enslaved Africans that were here in the colonies. And so European indentured servants and enslaved Africans teamed up, and and then there was only like about 3% of folks who, like, in particular in Virginia, that like own land, right, and work in the land, and there were people who own the land. And so somebody woke up one day and said, you know what, let's team up together, the enslaved Africans and the indentured Europeans, and let's team up and beat these guys. They almost did, but then they lost, and then the folks who are landowners implemented the golden rule. That's he that has a goal makes the rules. And so, so what they decided to do was they created this a law that says white people cannot be slaves. They can be maybe Christian servants, but they can't be slaves. And if you're black, the assumption is that you are a slave. And so you have to prove that you're not a slave, and then um, um, you have to prove that you're not a slave. And then if you're a white person, then you cannot be a slave. And that's the first moment that white privilege got started.
Mm.
And it did change the status of those poor white indentured servants. I mean, like, from an economic standpoint, it just kind of said, like, hey, you could step up and be like that rich landowner, and you have somebody looked down upon. And if you kind of like look at the history of America, like, that's has been the story in the space. Like, the poor black man, the poor immigrant, and the poor white person have a lot more in common than their wealthier counterparts, right? But what the whole point of race was created was to kind of create this disorder that would keep folks down and not to move up. And so here's a way to think about privilege. And I think this is really hard, particularly people who might be white and poor, to understand about privilege. There are a lot of poor white people. There are more poor white people than there are poor black people or poor Hispanic folks or even poor Asians, just by the sheer number of numbers.
Sure.
What white privilege means is that if you're poor, you're not poor because you're white. You're poor for another reason, but it's not because that you're white. And there wasn't laws that were in place that disenfranchise you because of the color of your skin. And because of that, that allows you to, at least if you wanted to, or if you knew how to take advantage of certain opportunities in America. And what wouldn't get in your way is your skin color. And so that is maybe a way to understand white privilege, but it's hard. It's a really challenging and hard thing to deal with, because every white person doesn't get a chance to take the full benefit of being white.
But I do think, I mean, I feel like if Ahmaud was a white guy running down the street, no matter how poor or rich he was, it would have been a different experience. Now, I don't know what is in these men's hearts. I do know that I listened to the newscast that talked about a 911 call that was made, and the actual statement that was said was, "Is this person committing a crime?" And they said, "He's a black man running down our road." So to me, white privilege is the ability to live in the color of the skin that assumes that every freedom and justice and rule of America applies for me, and that I get to
Yeah.
have that on my side. And what
Yeah.
I see when I see this story is the exact opposite of that. Like I just, and especially, I mean, if you go white on white, if the scenario was white on white, then if you really want to flip the script, then make it be armed black men in a pickup
Yeah.
truck who are claiming citizen's arrest with a white guy who's clearly just running, like it's just
Yeah.
jogging.
Yeah.
So
Yeah. Yeah.
that to me is like, that's why we have to talk about it, because if you insert different components in any part of the story, you would never hear it. You would
Yeah.
never ever hear that.
Yeah, it's 100%. I mean, definitely. I mean, like you, particularly as a black man, you learn how to navigate to not see yourself as a threat. I just saw a Twitter post by my friend Micah Edmondson, who is a brilliant brother, PhD in Dr. King's
Hmm.
The Odyssey, and he was like, "Man, when I leave my house, it doesn't matter that I'm a Presbyterian pastor and that I have a PhD. I have to manage the reality that I perceived as a threat.
I
You
saw
know,
that.
yeah, and he, I mean, it's true. You know, and that's something that we have to. That's just something we have to navigate, and that's another kind of quote unquote privilege of being white is that you don't have to navigate that like that just because of the color of your skin, and that's, I mean, that's a daily thing. I had to go to the bank the other day and I had to wear a mask, and I had a visceral response walking
Hmm.
into Wells Fargo with a mask on because that went against every single thing I didn't learn in my life since a little boy. And I mean, and I know everybody's doing COVID and all that kind of stuff, but it just,
You
it
feel
was
it.
a visceral, yeah, it was a visceral. I mean, I was just so surprised by that. Really so surprised by that.
So I'm going to post a question here. How do I express my anger for racial injustice without overstepping boundaries? This is from a white woman. Um, Talk to me about kind of what are some steps that we can take. Like if people on this particular conversation are like, yeah, I want to understand what, if anything, if you're saying this is the way it is it really the way it has to be? Or how do we move forward? Like you said, we're not moving as quickly as maybe we could be.
Yeah, one of the things that I would really encourage folks to understand, particularly as like Christians, is that we need to see like all emotions as a gift from God, right?
Mhm.
And the Bible doesn't say don't be angry. It says it assumes that you will be angry, but do not sin.
Yeah.
And so, like, how do you direct your anger? And actually, I think this Tuesday coming up at 7 o'clock, we're actually doing a webinar with Missio Alliance. You can kind of like Google it at 7 o'clock, and we're going to talk about discipling the four complicated emotions of
Okay.
fear, anger, shame, and grief. Um, and I forgot what the order of it is, but when you deal with issues of race, class, and culture, you're going to have feelings of fear, shame, anger, and grief.
Hmm.
And unfortunately, a lot of times in Christian context, we don't know how to disciple people through those, and we have people to shut those things down, and you actually need to know how to handle these things because God gives us emotions, just like pain is a gift to know that something's wrong, that something's like deeper, and so you need to understand like what am I angry about? What is the nature of anger? And like and justice should be a thing that you should be angry about it. And then the
Yeah.
question is, how do you redirect that, right? So for some people, their anger becomes like they lash out at others. Some people internalize it and get depressed. But I think a first move is like maybe move the anger towards intercession, right?
Right.
Move the anger towards prayer. I think to process it, to try to go deeper, to say, hey, what is it that I'm actually angry about? And then from there, go and say, like, okay, what can I do about it? Some people might say, hey, David, you don't seem all angry and bitter. And I'm like, I'm not bitter. Of course I'm angry because this stuff is messed up. But you got to direct your anger into something towards this productivity, right? And
Right.
I definitely want to encourage the listeners and no matter what race, ethnicity, and gender you are, like to really direct your anger towards productivity.
So what could that look like? So one of the questions that came in was, hey, I'm as a white woman, I feel like I can't help. I'm in the Pacific Northwest where I'm not like exposed to the same kind of maybe racial injustices that we experience in the South. So where's a good place to start?
So I saw one question. Somebody asked, like, what could I learn about like white privilege?
Yeah.
There's a really great. So I want to give you. I'm a big reader, and I'll give you some references.
And I'll put
Um,
this up, you guys, I'll put this up in the comments. So if you don't have a pen or something right now, I'll make sure that we get all of David's recommendations. They like it when you preach, David, so make sure you speak up.
All right, cool. All right, so number one is like the book White Privilege. No, White Fragility. White Fragility by Robin DiAngelo. And this is not a Christian book, but this is a social scientist that if I would try to reframe it in Christian language, is really trying to say, like, she's owning the fact that racism is a sin. And
Okay.
she is like trying to like understand, like, how do I go through a sanctification process when I admit this? It's just kind of like somebody with like an addiction or like a AA. They're like, hey, I have an addiction. What are the habits that I need to do to kind of overcome this addiction?
Mm.
And so and kind of white privilege and whiteness, she kind of processes it that. And I would, again, it's not the Bible. She's not a Christian, but I don't put that expectation on it. But if you can kind of see what some of that concepts, that'd be really great.
I think too, for me in this process over the years, one of the things that I've had to work against is a feeling like I'm not one of them. So like
Yeah,
I actually want to try to put my own whiteness down and be like,
yeah,
well, this is about those other racists. It's not about me. And
yeah,
that's also dangerous
yep,
because I need to embrace that I am a person who has privilege that
yeah,
I don't need to feel ashamed about it because I
yeah,
didn't choose it. But I
yeah,
also need to like really pay attention and
yeah,
pay attention to those flash moments that you have where you guard yourself because you see a black man walking down the street. The flash
yeah,
moment where I see this happen a lot where there's almost a sense of, well, that's like my white black friend. That's my
yeah,
outlier
yeah,
friend, as if you're going to keep
yeah,
everybody else over in some other category, like
yeah,
because it's
yeah,
a dehumanizing thing to categorize like that.
yeah,
So if you're on
yeah,
this call or this conversation, you're probably already thinking to yourself, I'm a more enlightened white person.
yep,
And I would just encourage you to like really listen to
yeah,
your quick reactions, because
yeah,
we've been socialized as well.
yeah, totally. And that's the thing. Daniel Hill has this book called Wide Awake, and um, he's just kind of talking about his own spiritual transformation. That's one of his steps in a like 7-step process of redeeming kind of white identity. And so I would highly recommend that. And then the third book I would recommend is particularly I was thinking about the sister that's in northwest of the
Yeah.
country is my friend Ken Weissman wrote a book called The Myth of Equality.
Mm.
And if you kind of even want to go deeper, there's another one called The Color of Law. And so kind of it's real important to understand that our country's history of racism isn't just in the South. It's all over the country. And, and the way racism looked in like the Northwest was against Asian people,
Mm-hmm.
and against Hispanic brothers and sisters. And it's been, it's all over the place, and so I think in ways that if we can kind of begin to see it, then we can speak up. We can kind of go through our own transformations. And I would say, make sure that you're being patient with other folks, because like the way that you kind of came to the point of wherever you are today, it didn't happen overnight.
That's right.
And so you got to kind of like help to like let the spirit have some breadcrumbs from other people and stay in the fight. Because one thing as a white person, you could walk away from this at any point. You could just be like, hey, I'm just tired of dealing with this
Yeah.
race stuff. I'm just going to kind of go back to my thing. And it's like, I can't do. I mean, I could change my vocation, and I could like not do it as a vocation, but I can't change it as an experience as a
Mm.
black man in America, right? And as a white person, you can. And so I just would encourage you to see reconciliation as spiritual formation, as ways that God is inviting you in to go deeper, to grow closer to Him, to be a better, kind of human, and helping your fellow brother and sister in the world.
Yeah, I think I really appreciate that, and I've always appreciated how gentle you are and humble about like engaging with where people are in the process, and that scolding and that's not going to work. That doesn't, it actually is more divisive than
Yeah.
unifying.
Yep.
And I feel like in the process for me along the way, first of all, I loved to believe my narrative that I was like different than other people because I grew up in the military and I lived in a very sort of, I have a Korean brother, like all these reasons. But the
Yep.
reality is I grew up in a system of racism as well.
Yeah.
And part of that was having to get over like asking an awkward question. So the first step is, you start to read things that you haven't read before. You follow people that you don't agree with on social media,
Yeah.
like start to do
Totally.
that.
Yeah.
And then hopefully you have a relationship around in your life and
Yeah.
you can say, I'm sorry if I sound ignorant,
Yeah.
or, I'd rather be a person who desires to step into the mess a little bit. And if I
Yeah.
offend, or if that person doesn't receive that or is angry, I'd rather have tried than
Yeah.
just act like, let's just pretend like we can't see color when I know that
Yes.
that's a person of color's
Yes.
experience.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
Yeah. Totally. And I think that's the thing. Like, I think there is a destination of what we would look like. Equality, equity would be kind of the way, like everybody gets the same opportunities, right?
mhm.
Um, Equality means everybody gets treated the exact same. Equity means that people get the same opportunities,
Mm,
and I think that's a little bit different. So for example, you're a little bit shorter than me, and so if
a little bit.
and so if we
I'm
had a
offended.
box.
That was rude.
If we had a box that was all like 2 feet looking over a fence that was the same side, and I was like, well, you got a 2 foot box and I have a 2 foot box, but you can't still see over the fence. Then I was like, well, I'm treating you equally. But what equity looks like is that, your box might be a little bit taller than mine, but at the end of the day, we're kind of even out to be able to see the same kind of
Mm,
opportunity. And so
yeah.
that's kind of how you want to begin to think through like what we're trying to go after. And this is the other thing I want to say. We're doing this from a kingdom perspective.
Yeah.
Like this is the thing that we have to bring into this conversation, is that like we're doing this because of like Acts 2:42, because the Spirit's at work in the church, and that like nobody should be lacking anything because of God's Spirit of God is working
Mm.
in Christians' lives, right? And like the way that we engage with one another. And so that's very different than the kind of lies that we're told through the American dream and the values that are coming out of that experience.
Do you think we have a responsibility politically?
But I think so I know for me, a lot of people bled and died so I could vote. So it's like I
Mm.
committed to vote. Um, and I'm not too excited about the choices. I'm just voting for an adult this year. So like anybody that acts like an adult, I'll vote for that person. And so
I don't know though. But like when it comes to Ahmaud, and
yeah,
there's Run with Maud. You can go and go to that website. You can sign a petition. You can make a phone call.
yeah,
You can do a virtual run. What is your thought on sort of, because we've got this kingdom minded. I think that sometimes Christians use kingdom minded living as a reason to not act. Like, well, in
yeah,
the kingdom, and so I can do things privately, but I don't have to do
yeah.
anything publicly. What's your thought on that?
Yeah, I think some of that disconnect is actually a real poor reading of scripture. I
Hmm.
mean, the Messiah wasn't just only a spiritual leader that they were expecting. They were expecting a political leader
That's
that
right.
was going to come and kind of make Israel great again, And his you know, he had a zealot that was a part of it. He had a tax collector. I mean, he was really involved, and he really Jesus got killed not for spiritual reasons, from the Romans' perspective, it was for political charges, right? To being a threat to the empire.
Yeah.
And so it's just important that we don't like take out the political aspect of what's going on in the scriptures. And so I do think there's a lot of stuff that we could do. And I think there's a lot of things that we should do, particularly we live in a country where we can vote, where we can make noise that, and again, like, where you live is different than where I live. I mean, you live in the suburbs, I live in the city. If I call, I mean, if I make a phone call, they'll pay attention that somebody's from the zip code is calling.
Right.
But when somebody calls in your suburban neighborhood about what's going on in my urban community, they really pay attention. And there's a lot that we could do, right? And what does it take from us out of the phone call, right? Like, these are things that we could do. I mean, like, and I see somebody talking about like sharing stories, like, I think like having a conversation and like, kind of doing what we're doing right now, I think is really, really key. And I do think that political action is a really important thing. The one last thing I would say about this is to realize, like, I think we live in a time of like microwave change, right?
Yep.
And so it's important for us to understand that change doesn't happen in a microwave perspective. The NAACP, National Advancement of Colored People, was established in 1909. And it wasn't until 1954 that Brown versus the Board of Education came into existence. It was almost 45 years before they saw fruit of their political action. And so it's really important for us to realize, like, the long obedience in the same direction.
Yes.
That we need to kind of engage in, and not just be like, well, I just said something on Twitter and I posted about, the latest tragedy. I'm an activist. Like we can't do that kind of stuff.
Right. And that's actually another question that came in was, how do we avoid that feeling? Well, I did something, I shared something, I signed a petition. That was Molly's question. And I think I appreciate your perspective on the long change.
Yeah.
And a lot for me, I'm like, it changes with the next generation as well.
Yeah.
I mean, we have influence, responsibility. Now, of course, the problems they're overwhelming. The problems are daunting.
Yeah.
But to your point, many people, I think, see the big problems and think, well, I can't solve that big problem, therefore there's nothing for me to do.
Yeah.
Rather than kind of living, as we started our beginning of our conversation, you said, what about lament and prayer?
Yeah.
What about, sometimes I'll look at my bookshelf and I'm like, every book on my bookshelf was written by a white man.
Yeah.
Like, what does that say about what I'm shaping my life around? And that takes work. Like, it takes humility. I got to ask people. I'm not sure,
Yeah.
And so you gotta be uncomfortable in a lot of ways for a long time.
Yeah.
To even begin, I think, to enter into what could be lasting change.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think it's like, I mean, that's kind of why you want to say, like, this is a long spiritual journey, right?
Yes.
This isn't just like something, because unfortunately in a couple of weeks there's going to be a new thing, right? Like, it's going to be something else to get us our attention. But if we could see this as a deep, long spiritual journey of transformation, then we actually can do a lot. And I think one of the things I really encourage people to do is kind of take inventory of the things that you have influence over. We oftentimes look at Dr. King, and I talk about like the holiday version of Dr. King, because if you start listening to like some of Dr. King's sermons, a lot of people who like to quote Dr. King wouldn't like Dr. King anymore. but
say more.
I mean, like his To America sermon, his Riverside sermon. I mean, like, particularly close to the time he was getting assassinated, when he talked about militarism, materialism, and racism. Like, I mean, it's Cornel West has a really great book called Radical King, and just really talking to Sharon about him. But like, here's the thing about King that's really important. Let me say one thing about King. Like, his letter from a Birmingham jail, should be like with like the Westminster's Confessions. Like, it should be part of like Federalist Papers. Like, I mean, it's both an amazing theological document, and it's also amazing historical and kind of political, social theory document. And so I would highly recommend that. But going back to King didn't set out to like just be somebody famous or to like change the world. And I get really, I'm in a lot of, I'm a Christian professional, and people always talk about, hey, we're going to start a movement, and it's like, no, we're going to like end modern day slavery or whatever the case may be, like, and just do this like kind of like big audacious thing.
Yeah.
What King was really trying to do was the reason why he ended up getting in front of that camera was he was the youngest pastor. He was trying to get away from his dad's church. He was in Montgomery, Alabama. He was the only pastor that had the least amount to lose, but they were all showing up there because they were just trying to care for their parishioners. He was trying to do the thing that he had influence over within his community. And so I think it's important for us to like think locally and see what do we have influence over. Like you got influence over your children, your neighbors, your church, your work. And so just thinking about like in those 4 areas, right? In your family, like your extended family, just think about like there's a lot of people that have a lot of influence. And think about the vocation that you have, right?
Yeah.
And how can you do a little bit of long obedience in the same direction? How could you invite more people? How can you provide more opportunities? The way that you do your philanthropy and your giving, how can you allocate resources in a different way to give access to communities who have historically been on the margins of access to capital? And you're like, well, I'm not Bill Gates, or when I get to be Bill Gates, then I'll do it. And they're like, if you're not doing it now, then you're not going to do it when you become Bill Gates. And so, like, that's like these are a lot of stuff that you could do.
$5, you're not giving up $500,000. So
right, exactly, yeah. And so I think these are like, I think there's a lot of opportunity that we can have to really make a significant difference.
I love that. And you the work you do with Arrabon, you actually provide cultural training to churches, organizations, nonprofits that goes into this kind of conversation. You actually have material and materials that churches can use in their small groups, and that can be a great way to start a conversation among Christians. Olivia asks, what are other ways to start the conversation? Olivia, I'm just going to answer from my own perspective that I try to talk about my personal experience more so than like convince other people to come over to where my side. I try to talk about experiences that I've had with my family, with my Asian brother, with my own, I'll talk about my friendships with my Black friends in the sense of like, I want to just make this normal. Like, let's just, and you start to throw, like you said earlier, David, you put some breadcrumbs out, you'll be able to tell really quick who is in a place that they want to receive and maybe have this conversation. We don't want to, there's plenty of people who will want to have it. Let me put it that way. You don't need to waste time with people who don't.
Yeah, I 100% agree. Like, I think some of the ways that I think the enemy gets us is that they get us tired. Like, we cast our pearls before swine. And it's like, we don't want to sit around in places of like judgment, but like when Jesus sent the disciples out, the 12 and the 72, he said, hey, go find a person of peace and then share the kingdom of God, like heal and deliver. And so what you want to do when you find a person of peace, it's like, how can you talk about white privilege, racism, the systemic injustice of America, not in a way that you can kind of vent, not in a way that you can kind of get stuff off your chest so you can feel good about yourself, but how can you say it in a way that could both be healing to this person and deliver them from the evil that the enemy wants to operate in their lives? And so when I'm sharing with folks, I'm sharing out of a place of healing and deliverance. I'm not sharing out of a place of like, I just need you to know this information, or let me drop the mic, or whatever the case may be, And I think but I'm also looking for those people of peace that want to have a conversation. And it's been my experience that probably like 70 to 80% of people in the country want to figure something out.
Yeah.
But it's that 10 to 15% that's making all the noise.
Yeah.
and it's like 15% on the left, 15% on the right.
Yeah.
But it's that 70 to 80% that's like in between. Like they're like, hey, I might be a little more left and a little more right, but we got to figure this out,
Yeah.
And I think there's a lot more people that want to have a decent conversation to learn than those that don't.
Yeah. Well, I think, just to kind of sum up a couple of things you said that I've heard you say, just for those of people who are like, well, what exactly do I do though? First, you said this is a sanctification process. This is a spiritual transformation. It's not a political or physical transformation. So that means it's a long process.
Yeah.
Second of all, you gave us some resources to read if we want to read. And the thing that really is sticking out to me a lot when it comes to the long run is that question about actually evaluating your influence and looking at where you have a voice, whether that's your family, your neighborhood, the way you spend your money, where you give your money, those, like, be aware that you have more influence than you think.
Yeah.
And how do you use it wisely? I also want to say, I mean, the people who are here obviously care about this. There's a lot of things to care about. This is like a very dark and evil world. And listen to what to do with your anger and how to direct your anger, because God calls us all to different expressions of that. And they are all needed. So I love what you said. I'll post the Missio Alliance thing about the anger, shame, guilt.
Yeah.
Okay.
And just also, like, let me just add to that, right? Like, no matter what your passion is, like, because colonialism, racism, white supremacy is such a deep disease in our country, like, there's not one person that's not affected by this.
Yeah.
Like, even like people of color are affected by this. And so, like, we're all affected by this. And this is sin, and it's a disease of the enemy, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so no matter what your passion is, it's in there. Like, you're like, hey, I'm passionate about hockey. It's in there. Like, what I mean? Like, I'm passionate about hair. It's in there. Like, like, just, this is like one thing that you could do that can actually kind of help you. If you kind of bring this lens in, then your little piece of the reconciliation puzzle, like, you can fit in and do something to kind of help bring wholeness and healing to the world.
I love that. Well, thank you, David, so much for your time and for
so glad
all
to be
that
here.
you shared. I will gather all that stuff that you shared, just tons of resources. Go check out Arrabon if you haven't. You guys, that'll be a great next step for you as well. David.
Cool. Thanks.
Thank you.
Blessings. Thank y'all.
Blessings. Bye.
Thanks for tuning in to Let's Be Real with Nicole Eunice. We'd love to hear from you. Have a topic to suggest or a tricky situation you need help with? Send us an email or a voice memo to nicole@nicoleeunice.com and we may feature you on the show. And don't forget to subscribe to the podcast so you don't miss an episode.